Hi there, I'm back with a new watercolor video, and today we are going to focus on light and shadow. It is a nice wintry scene with the early morning sun rising up behind the farmhouse, but the true subject here is the light. And these trees and all these wooden poles and these fences, they all make these beautiful long cast shadows with these streaks of sunlight in between. Now, how to paint these nice light and shadow effects in watercolor? So in this video I'm going to paint from this photo and I'm going to show you the full process. I'm going to paint the warm and cool colors in the sky. I'm going to paint all these soft shadows in the grass and all these different types of hard and soft shadows that cover the country road. So make yourself comfortable and I hope you enjoy the process. Okay, so let's start with the drawing first. And I will briefly show you how I make the drawing for this painting. On the reference photo that you can see in the top right, you can see that I have created a grid and I have drawn the same grid on my paper. And I'm using a tool called a scale divider to basically take the grid from the photo and then blow it up to a larger size to fit the size of my paper. That scale divider is very useful for if you want accurate measurements of things, and I use it especially for things like buildings in a landscape. So it's always the question where to start first with your drawing, and I've decided to start with the barn building, the farmhouse first, and with the scale divider and the grid I measure where I should begin drawing, and then I can sort of fill the rest in myself. So for the larger shapes I use a 3B pencil, and for smaller details I also use this technical pencil. And things like trees are easier to draw freehand. You don't have to do as much measuring, but what I often do is measure where I place the trunk of the tree. So with the scale divider, I measure the position of the trunk, and then I can just loosely fill in the rest. You want to keep the sketch very loose. You don't want to draw every little branch of the tree with your pencil. That's absolutely not necessary. So the rest of the tree can be finished in the painting stage. You can paint all those branches with the watercolor paint instead of with your pencil. So now I've drawn the rest of the farmhouse and some of those lines with the technical pencil for more precision. And now I'm just loosely with the pencil drawing in the line of the road. And in the photo you can see that the road is very straight, and even when there are some curves in the road, when you take a photograph it often looks very straight in the photo, and that's just not that interesting visually. So what I often do with these country roads, I just give them more of a curve, more of a bend in the drawing. So it's not necessary to strictly follow your reference photo. And here I am drawing in all these wooden poles and the fence. And all those poles and fences, they do create some extra interest. These vertical lines, they contrast with the horizontal lines of the horizon and the barn house. And all these poles and fences will give very nice drop shadows when we start painting. So we're about done here, I think. I've put in just enough detail in the drawing so I don't get lost when I'm going to apply the paint. So let's now go to the painting phase and put on the first wash. Okay, let's apply the first wash of watercolor. That's always an exciting moment. So what I'm going to do first is paint the sky. Now the sky does look a little bit complicated. You have this bright sunlight on the left, and we have these blue clouds of the early morning, and you also have these streaks of orange morning light in the sky. And what I want to try to do is paint these orange and blue colors without mixing them too much, because when you mix the orange and the blue, it can get muddy, or you can get this greenish tint. So I am going to paint this very carefully. And first, I'm going to wet the surface of the paper with a large flat brush. This is actually a brush that's also used for applying varnish to paintings, but it's very suitable for wetting the paper. So to create this sort of soft sky, you have to make sure the paper is really thoroughly wet. I want the paper to have this nice sheen. This is quality cotton paper that I'm working on from Sanders Waterford. And this quality 100% cotton paper, such as Sanders or Arches, it really soaks up a lot of water. It's really thirsty paper, so I make sure it is nice and wet, and then I can apply the first paint. Now I do want to have some control over how I paint the sky, so I don't apply too much water on it. So I have laid the paper flat because if I put it at a steeper angle, all of the paint that I apply on it would run down to the bottom, and all these colors would mix with each other, and that's exactly what I'm trying to avoid here. And because the paper is lying flat, the camera angle is slightly different, so I try not to show my head too much in the video. So I'm starting out testing a few of the colors. I've applied some of the orange in the sky, and now I'm just testing out some of the blues. So usually cobalt blue is a very good blue for the sky. Sometimes ultramarine, but what I often find is that cobalt blue with just a little bit of cerulean blue comes closest to the color of the sky that I see in the photo. Okay, so there is the first bit of blue. I'm filling up the top part of the sky. And now with a large mop brush I put in some of these clouds by lifting off some of that blue paint. And I use a damp brush for that. I clean it in between with water, then dry it, then lift up the paint again. Putting in some extra details, and as you can see I'm not using the palette that I have there on the right, but for these larger washes I use a separate mixing palette with this sort of flower shape, and I can just hold that in my hand while painting. So for the warmer tones in the sky I used some Naples yellow. I really like to use Naples yellow in skies, and you can mix that with some orange or even some red. So the sky is starting to look nicely. I've used just enough water that you get these soft transitions between these different colors, and you don't get these hard edges. And also not so much water that everything blends together and all these colors start mixing. And now with the lower part of the painting wet and shiny, we can start with the grass. And you have to be careful that you use enough pigment, because watercolor always dries lighter. And with the sky that's not always a problem, but with things like the middle ground and foreground, and this becomes more noticeable. I want the grass to have a vivid color, so I'm mixing a lot of cadmium yellow, a little bit of Indian yellow to make it a bit more orange, to get that warmer morning light, and some sap green for a nice bright green. And then you have these low grasses underneath the fences, and those are more warm in color, more sort of orange, and they have these bluish shadows in them. And some more of that grass right next to the road, keeping it light in the middle where there's a bit of morning frost on the grass. Applying some extra water again, painting some of that warm morning light on the road. And all the while the grass that I've painted is still quite wet, so I've been mixing up some darker green for the shadows. And now with this large mop brush I'm painting in these shadows in the still wet layer, and to help it a bit I spray an extra bit of water to make sure that it doesn't dry up on me. Because you can see in the reference photo that these shadows are really nice and soft. The trees in the background, they create these really long drop shadows with really soft edges, so that's what I'm painting first in the underlying layer. And then I can paint some harder and darker shadows on top of that. Because if you look closely at the photo, you can see multiple layers of shadow on top of each other. And I keep switching between larger and smaller brushes, because sometimes I want these really large shapes, and sometimes I want these thinner, smaller lines and details. Now I'm adding some of these smaller patches of shadow that define the texture of the grass. I just stipple them on, and because the underlying paint is still wet, you can see it spread out and soften, and that's the effect that I'm looking for. That's that. It will probably dry a bit too light, but we'll see how we fix that later. And now I'm preparing a mixture for continuing these shadows that go from the grass all the way over the road. Adding some extra paint to the mix. And some more of these streaks of shadow. Little bit there. Now painting in some of that shadow on the grass next to the road with a smaller brush. Just dropping in a bit more dark shadows, a bit of detail in the background. And now for the right side of the road, where you have these wintry willow trees, I'm applying some of these darker tones. And you really want to create an interesting mixture, because you see these blue shadows, but also these orange patches of light. You want to have both in that wash, but you don't want to meddle around too much in it, because when you start mixing those warm and cool colors too much, then the effect gets lost and you get this muddy tone. And now the background layer has dried up reasonably well. Now the background layer is quite dry, so I can put on some of those first details, creating this darker line next to the road. And on the other side as well. So now we got the ground covered, so we can continue to the next phase. Okay, so as you can see, I have placed the paper on a bit steeper angle, because now we're going to paint more of the details. What I want is to get that bead, as it is called. So you apply a wet layer of paint, and because of the angle of the paper, the water will go down and form this bead on the bottom of the wash. Now let's paint some of those trees and bushes in the background. So starting with a lighter mixture first, then adding some darks into it. We want to get some of these nice wet and wet effects in the background. Soften up this bottom edge a little bit. And now continuing to the right. And there's this sort of shed in the background, this wooden shed. And it is a nice transition, nice gradients from light to dark. So first I paint in this sort of orange color. And then I will put in some darker blue and let that blend a bit. And where you have that large middle tree, that stands in front of the farm, on the bottom it has this sort of glow. The sun shines on these lower twigs, and I want to capture that glow and let it melt with the farmhouse. So first I'm painting that area with warm color. Make sure to use enough water, because we want this to stay wet so we can continue working in it. And now I go back into that wash with a darker mixture. As you can see, I'm creating this top of the roof of that outbuilding there. Now letting it blend into that warm glow. And to create this darker mixture, I often use some neutral tint in it, mixed with other colors such as cobalt or ultramarine blue, some burnt sienna, and sometimes also a bit of yellow ochre or raw umber. Now we can start building up the shape of the barn that I've drawn. And the roof is this sort of bluish with a hint of green in it, which you can achieve by adding some raw umber. Expanding that roof to the right, making it a little bit darker as I go along. I'm not painting the lower part yet with the bricks. I'm doing the roof first, working from top to bottom and from left to right. And now we have these two chimneys as well. So I paint those with a slightly warmer mixture. And in the bottom, on the bottom of the farm and where the trees meet the ground, you have these dark occlusion shadows. That glow is still wet, so I can blend that with these dark shadows on the ground. And continuing further to the right, now I can paint in the lower half of the building. I think the roof is still slightly moist, so that's good. Then we get a nice soft transition between the roof and the brickwork below it. Now the bottom part of the barn has a slightly different color. It's this sort of blue grayish natural stone, and above that you have these red bricks. So while that is drying a little bit further, I'm continuing this shadow to the left, dividing these two pieces of grass. Now I can add some more dark shadows here. Painting the shadow on that outbuilding. And now let's mix a nice brick color and continue with the main farm building. So I use a bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of alizarin to make it a little bit more purplish, and a little bit of blue to tone it down. You can add a bit of earth tone as well. And now the silhouette of the farm starts to form. Painting the shape of that roof. And now in this wet layer I drop some very dark thick paint to create the shadow line under the roof. Making this side of the barn a little bit darker. But not too much. And now I can paint in some of these details. I'm going to just paint in some dark windows first, and they will probably dissolve a lot because the layer is still wet, but I will have just enough information to see where those buildings are located, and then later I can go over those windows again. And behind the farm building there are a few more of these buildings, so I'm going to paint the top of that a bit darker. But there are these bushes in front that catch a lot of light of the sun, so I'm going to paint that lighter color in there and let it blend. That's a nice gradient. Okay, let's paint in some of the first trees. That's the nice part about winter. The sun rises a lot later, so it's much easier to get up early in the morning, get on your bike and start cycling in the countryside, and then you encounter scenes such as these. The sun has barely come up yet, and you get this beautiful warm light for hours on end. And it slightly shifts throughout the morning to this more white light. And you have all these trees with these bare branches, typical for winter painting. So I'm starting with the main branches first, using enough water, otherwise it dries quickly. I'm only focusing on the largest branches here to get the most important shape. And now let's work on the right side of the painting. You have these willow trees with these thick trunks, and they stand at an angle. They sort of lean over diagonally. And I'm just treating these shapes as a silhouette, letting these trees interconnect. Putting in a darker mixture and slightly wettening the edges there. And just dropping in this dark mixture with a lot of neutral tint in it. And it's easy to make it too light because it will draw up a lot lighter. Completing these shapes here. Now, as these trees are drying, I'm mixing a shadow mixture with some cobalt blue, a bit of neutral tint, and maybe a hint of burnt sienna, and I'm starting to paint these drop shadows. And I'm placing these on top of the softer shadows that I've already painted. And I'm making them connect with these willow trees, because that entire shadow area I want to keep it one shape as much as possible. And these willows, they have these large branches that reach up into the sky, so I'm painting already some of them with a slightly warmer mixture, and then later I will go over that with a darker shadow mixture. Back to the shadows on the road. With a smaller brush I can also add a few thinner lines. So all these fences, and post they'll cast these thin lines over the road. And I'm mixing more shadow color on my flower palette as I go along. And now for these larger shadow shapes. This one's a bit tricky because the shape of that fence is also in it, and it also has some gaps of light in it, making it connect with the willows. I want to preserve the patch of warm light there, so I'm lifting up a bit of that shadow. And continuing on, drawing the shape of that fence. With a large brush like this, you can still create some fine details as long as you have a good tip on it. And that is the fence. Building out the shape. Adding some finer lines. It really helps to contrast these larger shapes with these very fine details. It really puts more elegance and refinement in your painting. And now the cast shadows of these wooden poles. And another one, drawing them carefully. Back to the shadow area on the right. And now the drop shadows of these fence posts in the foreground. I think this mixture is a little bit too dark compared to the other ones, but we can make it a bit lighter by lifting some of the paint. And these are the last ones, these two in the foreground. And now adding some texture here. I don't want to complicate it too much, so what I will do is just go over it and just make it one shape. Any highlights in there I can also add later with gouache paint. And now let's paint an important part of the painting, and that is the tree in the middle that stands in front of the farmhouse. So with the Escoda Perla brush, I'm drawing the trunk first with a dark mixture of paint. I don't want it to be just a black silhouette, so I just can always lift a bit of the trunk up with a damp brush so that the underlying layer shows through. So again, I'm only painting the main branches first. I can simply let it dry and in a later stage add some more finer details. And you can still achieve some fine details with this Perla brush. And some more of these large branches that go towards the sky. From these horizontal branches also hang these sort of vertical branches, these small branches that are hanging from it, just like with a willow tree. And I'm not painting everything in this dark mixture because the sun also shines through it. So I put in some warmer orange red colors as well, especially for these smaller branches. So this tree is almost done for now. I can do the same for these other trees, add all these smaller branches. So I'm not going to show you all of it, that would be a bit tedious. So another thing to make these trees more interesting is to do a little bit of dry brush work and create these sort of clusters of branches in the crown of the tree. And now if the speed increased, let's do this tree as well. And again, not just this dark silhouette, but lifting parts of it up to create a bit of gradients, which just these spots of light. And here too, adding some more interest to the crown of the tree. Now I noticed that the shadows on the grass there and the grass itself have dried up a bit too light, and same actually goes for other parts of the first layer of this painting. It's very tricky to fix that in the second layer, but it can be done. So I've carefully wetted the surface again. I'm laying the paper flat because I don't want all the paint running down to the bottom. And I'm simply working over that first layer again, and I can again drop in all sorts of pigments. So I drop in cadmium yellow for the grass, and for the shadows some more dark green mixtures. So I've painted the shadows of these poles and fences, but not these things themselves. So that's what I'm doing now. And with the Perla brush, I'm painting these fence posts. And then with another brush I soften it up a bit where it meets the ground. Adding another one. And continuing along. Softening up again where it meets the ground. And simply completing the rest. Adding a little bit of detail there in the foreground. So now the edges of the road are quite well confined, but the road still misses a bit of texture. It's still a bit too smooth. So what I have here is another kind of brush. It's a simple a brush with these stiff hairs. You can find it basically anywhere. And with that I gently apply a bit of texture to the road. Also a little bit of texture in the grass there and the trees. Lifting some off a bit with a tissue and also splattering some of it. These brushes with these stiff hairs, they are also excellent for splattering effects. You can simply run your finger along the hairs and you get these paint splatters on your paper. Adding some more texture on the road with a regular brush. Very gently. And now I'm adding some more detail to these willow trees on the right, but I feel like I am overworking them a little bit. I liked it when they had these dark silhouettes, but that's okay, because I think when we add the highlights with gouache, that will really improve it. I think that will make a lot of difference. So yes, let's zoom in a bit and let's add those highlights to the painting. And you can't really do that with regular watercolor paint. Well, maybe to some extent, but I'm using this thick opaque paint for the highlights. You can use gouache that is pre-colored, or you could just take some Chinese white or white gouache paint and add watercolor pigment to it. That's another way to do it. So before I am going to add highlights to this fence, I'm going to paint these wires first with a darker watercolor mixture. And I'm using a tiny detail brush for that, a sable brush. And then when we have those lines in place, then we know where to put the highlights. And I'm painting it very subtly. You don't want these very strong lines. I don't want to see too much of those wires here, especially with the light of the sun shining through it. So yeah, we are now in the detail phase of the painting, where all that's left to do is finish it with lots of tiny details, and those are often pretty time consuming, but I will shorten it in this video. So here I am defining the windows, and I will add those highlights on top of it, but first I want to have these darker windows defined. So there's a lot of them actually, maybe a bit too much. I could have simplified it, of course. Maybe that would have been better and more iconic, but here I wanted to remain true to the architecture of this building. That's also part of the fun of watercolor is when you paint these buildings, you really get to know them and learn how they are constructed. At least when it comes to visual appearance. Okay, let's get the gouache now and actually put on those highlights. So I'm just putting it on these windows. And also with a small brush adding these lighter window frames. Now it's easy to overdo it, especially with this farmhouse painted as a sort of silhouette. So I'm going to make this effect a little less strong and just putting a tissue on it to soften things up a bit. What also helps with that when the paint is already dry is to just spray some water on it and then go back in with the tissue. But do that very carefully because we don't want to make a mess of it, especially with gouache. It's easy to just smudge all of that opaque paint over your beautiful watercolor layer, and that's not what we want to do. So those highlights that I've added, they are a lot softer now and they blend in more now with the farm. So what I can do then is go back in with some darker color and put in a little bit of extra detail in the windows. And I'm now going to paint some beautiful highlights on that slightly overworked area on the right. And you will see that drastically improves it. Adding some of these nice branches on top of it with this gouache starting to look a lot better already. It really breaks up those dark shapes. So yeah, this part of the painting is definitely improving. But of course we let's not overwork this either. And make sure we stop in time. Using that same light gouache mixture with a bit of extra white and paint some of these highlights on these fences and in the grass. And we can also bring some of that white back in the foreground of the painting to suggest some of that morning frost. And gouache is excellent for that. And then put in some blue shadows into the mix. So the painting is almost finished now. I've added some more of these finer twigs in the tree with this small detail brush, and I'm thinking of adding a figure in it, because without it it looks a little bit bare and lonely perhaps. I'm not sure if it really needs a figure. I mean, the effect of the sunlight and the shadow is already what defines this painting, but usually it does add some interest, some extra interest by adding a figure. It gives you something extra to look at. It gives a little bit of a story to it as well. So I'm adding a figure there, somewhere in the distance, and he is standing there on the side of the road. Maybe he is gathering some twigs, or maybe some bundles of reed. And I give him a bucket and a pair of boots, because in the winter you need good boots, because everything is quite muddy. Now, I think I'm painting the figure a little bit too small here, but I don't think it will be that noticeable as long as it looks alright. It is alright. And now with the figure added, I'm going to sign the painting in the lower right bottom. And I have this piece of paper with some signatures on it for reference. So this is how I sign my paintings these days, with these sort of medieval letters with the initials of my name, and then I put a rectangle around it, a bit like those Japanese prints. So it's a sort of mix between a Japanese signature and this sort of medieval stamp, as if I have a stamp that I just put on it. But you can see that I painted it by hand, and then I add a little crown on top. But there is still one final thing I need to do, and it's a little bit scary, because as it turns out, those shadows, those car shadows on the road are just not dark enough. The background layer has dried quite lightly, and when you compare it to the reference photo, those shadows are a lot darker and more pronounced. And I want to create a better connection between those shadows on the grass and those on the road. So I'm doing something that is very tricky, but it can be done. So it's easy when you work with a lot of water on top of layers that you've already painted to smudge them, and things get ugly. But I very gently applied a layer of water with that large square brush. That one is really my new friend. And with that layer of water added, I very gently put in some extra shadow. And hopefully this time it is dark enough. You see the difference already, and you see how that shadow is now already much more pronounced, and it also connects better to the shadow on the grass, which is basically the same shadow coming from that tree. I noticed that the paint started running down a bit, and that's not what I want, so I have laid the painting flat so that the paint stays in its place, because I want to preserve those streaks of light in between those cast shadows. So now quicken the drying process a little bit. This also fixes the paint a bit in its place. And then I will simply let it dry. And the painting is done. So there we go. That's the final painting. So I think I captured that feeling of a nice winter morning sunrise quite well. You have the warm light of the sun rising behind the farmhouse. You have these dark, long streaks of shadow going from the tree all the way over the road. So yeah, I'm quite happy with how it turned out. The road, the highlights on the road are maybe a little bit too saturated, a bit too orange, but apart from that, I think it's quite okay. The process, I mean, the process started quite well with the sky. I mean, I'm very happy with how the sky turned out. That went very smoothly and exactly the way I wanted it to. So I'm very happy with that. Unfortunately, the rest of the background dried up a bit too lightly, but it was quite useful to do it this way. And I learned that it is possible to add the second layer in a later stage of the painting without ruining the layers below that, because it's so easy to ruin them and to smudge the paint below it. But if you do it very gently and use this nice large square brush and very gently apply water on top of it, then you don't really disturb the underlying layers so much, and you can just drop in some extra paint. But you have to be careful with that. But I think it worked out well. So that maybe also shows you that when you encounter a similar problem, it's a problem that many, especially beginning watercolor painters experience. This shows you that it can be done to fix it afterwards. So that's still a thing that I sometimes don't get quite right the first time, and sometimes that's just very hard to do, to get those values right in the first layer. So sometimes you just need to add a second layer on top. That's just the way it is. So I hope you enjoyed the process that went into this painting. And every subject that you paint comes with a slightly different challenge. And the challenge in this one was to get that light and shadow right. And I hope that with this video I have inspired some of you to take on that challenge yourself. So if you like this video, please give it a like, subscribe if you want to see more, and we'll see each other next time. Bye bye.